The morning my son asked me to leave my own home so his fiancée could redecorate it, I didn't say a word. I simply picked up my coffee mug, walked out to the back porch, and let the Arizona sun burn the tears off my face before they could fall. That was 6 months before the wedding. By the time the wedding week arrived, I had learned to go quiet in ways I never thought possible. And then, 3 days before the ceremony, Brooke looked me straight in the eye and told me something that made every moment of that silence feel like a mistake I could never take back. What happened the morning of the rehearsal dinner changed not just my family, but hers in ways none of us saw coming. I need to go back further than that, though, because none of it makes sense without the beginning. My son Nathan grew up in a house where books lived on every surface, and dinner smelled like garlic and something slow cooking on the stove. His father passed when Nathan was 11, a sudden heart attack on a Tuesday morning, the kind of loss that doesn't announce itself. One day, our life was whole and ordinary. The next, it was just the two of us. Nathan and me, figuring out how to grieve without letting grief swallow us alive. I went back to full-time work at the elementary school where I'd been assistant principal. Within 3 years, I made principal. It wasn't the career path I'd planned. I had imagined slowing down, being more present, maybe volunteering in Nathan's classroom instead of running the entire building. But the mortgage didn't care about my plans. So I showed up every day, put on the suit, and did what needed doing. What I'm most proud of isn't my career. It's that Nathan never felt the absence of money. He never knew how many times I sat at the kitchen table after he went to bed, running numbers on the back of envelopes, moving figures around trying to make them add up. He never knew I skipped buying a winter coat 2 years in a row so he could go on the school ski trip with his friends. All he knew was that his mom packed his lunches, made it to every science fair, and had hot chocolate ready when he came home on cold afternoons. He grew up kind, quietly ambitious, the kind of man who holds doors open without thinking about it and actually listens when you talk. He became a structural engineer, honest work, careful work, the kind that requires patience and precision. I used to tell him, "You have your father's brain and my stubbornness," and he would laugh and say that sounded about right. When he brought Brooke home for the first time, I genuinely wanted to love her. She was striking, tall, polished, the kind of confident that fills a room before a person even speaks. She shook my hand firmly and complimented my kitchen in a way that felt more like an appraisal than a compliment. But I told myself I was being uncharitable. First impressions are rarely fair. The cracks came slowly at first. Small things. She'd arrive for Sunday dinners and spend the first 20 minutes on her phone while Nathan helped me in the kitchen. She'd answer questions I asked her in short, efficient sentences and then redirect the conversation back to herself. She never asked about my work, my friends, my life before Nathan brought her into it. I noticed, but I said nothing. Nathan was happy. That was what mattered. The first time something truly unsettled me was at Christmas, 2 years into their relationship. I had spent 3 days making Nathan's grandmother's tamales, a recipe that took patience, the right dried chiles, and a knowledge of when to push and when to let the masa rest. It was the one tradition from his father's side of the family that I'd kept alive. Nathan's face when he smelled them from the driveway as a child, that was a face I cooked for. Brooke took one look at the spread and said, lightly, as though it were nothing, "Nathan's been doing a cleanse this month." I should have mentioned it. I brought a cheese board. She set her store-bought arrangement in the center of the table. Nathan glanced at me and then looked away quickly, the way he used to when he was a teenager and knew he'd done something wrong but wasn't ready to address it yet. I smiled and said the tamales would keep. I smiled because that's what I do. I have been smiling through hard things since I was 38 years old. But when Brooke went to the restroom, my sister Barbara leaned over and whispered, "Carol, watch that one." I squeezed her hand and told her to be fair. I believed what I was saying, or I wanted to. The engagement happened on a trip to Sedona. Nathan called me from the road, his voice lit up with excitement. He wanted me to meet them for dinner to celebrate. I put on my good blouse and drove 40 minutes and sat across from them at a restaurant I couldn't really afford and raised my glass and meant every word of the toast I gave. I meant it because I love my son, and love means showing up with your whole heart, even when your instincts are whispering warnings you aren't ready to hear. The wedding planning was where the distance became impossible to ignore. I was not asked to any venue tours, not a single one. I found out about the venue they'd chosen through a photograph Brooke posted online. When I gently mentioned I would have loved to see it in person, Brooke smiled her smooth, practiced smile and said, "It was a quick decision. You know how these things go." I didn't, actually, but I nodded. I offered to help with the flowers. She said they had a florist. I offered to handle the rehearsal dinner. She said her mother was managing it. I offered to address and mail the invitations by hand, a small thing, a personal touch, the kind of detail that matters to people who value that sort of care. She thanked me and told me the printer was handling it digitally. Eventually, I stopped offering. Nathan called less. When I called him, the conversations were shorter, more careful. He'd answer my questions with 2 or 3 sentences and then say he had something on the stove or an early morning. I told myself he was busy. I told myself this was just what happened when children built their own lives. I told myself a lot of things that made it easier to sleep at night. Barbara didn't buy any of it. She kept telling me something was wrong. I kept telling her she was looking for problems. I think some part of me already knew the truth and simply wasn't ready to let it land. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Wednesday evening, 3 days before the rehearsal dinner. Nathan was working late. Brooke called and asked if she could stop by to drop off some items she'd been storing in my spare room. I said of course. She arrived at 7, set 2 boxes by the door, and then didn't leave. She walked into my kitchen, poured herself a glass of water from my tap as though she lived there, and leaned against my counter. Her voice when she spoke was quiet and deliberate, the way someone talks when they've rehearsed what they're going to say and want to make sure every word lands. "I think we need to clear the air before the wedding," she said. "Nathan and I have been talking about the future, our future, and I want to be honest with you, woman to woman." She paused. "After we're married, we're going to need space to become our own family, our own unit. That means some boundaries need to change." I set my mug down carefully. "What kind of boundaries?" She looked at me directly, without apology. "Nathan needs to focus on building something with me now, not maintaining old patterns. You've been a wonderful mother, Carol, but your season with him is done. He needs to invest his energy in his marriage, not in managing your feelings." I stared at her. "Managing my feelings," I repeated. "Sunday dinners every week, calling him every few days, dropping by when we haven't invited you." She tilted her head slightly. "It's a lot, and it's going to be a problem, so I need you to take a step back. A real step back, for everyone's sake." My throat tightened. I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell her that calling my son twice a week was not an imposition, that those Sunday dinners were the reason he grew up knowing he was loved, that I had spent 30 years building something for him, not for myself, and she did not get to walk into my kitchen and tell me my time was up. Instead, I said, very quietly, "Does Nathan know you're here?" She smiled. "Nathan supports everything I do." I walked to my front door and opened it. My hands were shaking, but my voice was even. "Good night, Brooke." She left without another word. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after she drove away. Then I sat down at the table where Nathan had done homework for 12 years, where I had cried alone after his father's funeral when Nathan was in bed, where I had signed the paperwork to refinance the mortgage twice so Nathan could finish his degree without loans. And I thought, if she is willing to say this to my face, what has she been saying to my son? I called Barbara. She drove over within 20 minutes and sat across from me at that same table while I told her everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Carol, I need to tell you something I've been holding on to for 2 weeks." She had run into Brooke's father at a real estate networking event. He had not recognized her as Nathan's aunt, so he'd spoken freely. In the course of the conversation, he'd mentioned his daughter was marrying an engineer, a solid earner, and then added, almost as an aside, that the young man's mother had a paid-off property in Phoenix that would eventually sort itself out. Barbara hadn't understood what he meant at the time. Now she did. My house. I had told Nathan, more than once and in writing in my informal will, that the house was his when I was gone. No mortgage, no debt, a home free and clear in a city where real estate had tripled in value since I bought it. Brooke's father, whose development company had burned through capital on 3 failed projects, knew exactly what that house was worth, and his daughter was marrying into it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and ran through every small moment again the way Brooke had looked at my house during her first visit. The casual suggestion months ago that Nathan and I should consolidate since I rattled around in a 3-bedroom alone, the comment she made once that older people often moved to smaller places and freed up equity. I had heard each of those things and filed them away as thoughtless. They were not thoughtless. They were a plan. The next morning, I called Linda, a woman I'd worked alongside for 20 years who had transitioned from teaching to estate law. I did not tell her everything, only that I wanted to review my property documents and understand my options. She met me for coffee and spent 2 hours walking me through what I needed to know. That same afternoon, I drove to the county recorder's office and made copies of every document attached to my property. Then I came home, sat at the kitchen table, and began to write down dates. Every dinner, every conversation, every dismissal, every pattern. I wrote it all down in a legal pad in handwriting so small it looked like I was afraid someone would find it. I didn't confront Nathan, not yet. He was 4 days from his wedding, and I did not want to be the woman who shattered his happiness with accusations he would not be ready to believe. I knew how this story went. I had read it in Brooke's confident posture, in her father's careless boast, in the way she stood in my kitchen like it was already hers. If I came to Nathan now, she would turn it around. She would make me the desperate, grasping mother who couldn't release her grip. And he would believe her, because love does that. It softens the edges of everything you don't want to see. So I waited. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant in Scottsdale. Nathan's friends, Brooke's family, a cluster of colleagues, and me seated, I noticed, at the far end of the table next to 2 cousins of Brooke's I had never met. Barbara sat beside me and squeezed my hand once under the table when Brooke gave a toast and neglected to mention me entirely. Not an oversight. Brooke did not make oversights. Nathan caught my eye once during dinner from across the table. He smiled, a little tired, a little strained. I smiled back. I have been smiling through hard things for a long time. What happened the next morning, I did not engineer. I want to be clear about that, because in the days that followed, Brooke's family would try to suggest otherwise. The truth was, I was sitting in my kitchen at 7 in the morning, drinking coffee and doing nothing except existing, when my phone rang. It was Nathan. His voice was unlike anything I had heard from him since the night I told him his father had died. Flat, stripped down, barely holding shape. "Mom," he said, "I need to come over." He arrived 20 minutes later in his rehearsal dinner suit, which he was still wearing. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and stared at his hands for a long moment. Then he said, "Her father called me last night after dinner. He wanted to talk about the house." I kept my face still. "My house," he said. Nathan stopped, pressed his fingers to his eyes. "He said that after the wedding, it would make financial sense for you to sign a transfer of equity to me and Brooke jointly, because they could leverage it for a new development. He had numbers. He had a whole presentation ready, Mom. On his phone, he showed me at the dinner table like he was closing a deal. I didn't say anything. He said you'd already discussed it, that you were on board." Nathan looked up at me. "Had you?" "No," I said. Something moved across his face. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are confirming something they already knew and were hoping to be wrong about. Then he asked me something I hadn't expected. He said, "What did Brooke say to you Wednesday night?" I told him. All of it, word for word, because I had written it down on the legal pad the same night it happened. I read it to him from the page, my voice steady, not performing grief, not asking for anything, just facts. Nathan sat with it for a long time. Outside, the morning light was doing what Arizona morning light does, sharp and golden and entirely indifferent to human pain. Finally, he said, She told me you were struggling with the transition, that you'd called her to talk about it, and that you were—" He stopped again. She made it sound like the conversation was your idea. I slid the legal pad across the table. He read every page. By 9 in the morning, he had called Brooke. I sat in the living room and gave him privacy, but the house is small and voices carry. I heard him ask her directly about his grandfather's house that her father had mentioned. I heard her say it was just preliminary conversation. I heard him read her the date and time from my notes. I heard her voice shift, register first dismissive, then soothing, then sharp, then the call ended. He came out of the kitchen and stood in the living room doorway, still in last night's suit, and he looked like the 11-year-old boy who'd watched me pack his father's winter coats into boxes for donation and had understood for the first time that some things didn't come back. "She knew about the house before we got engaged," he said. "Didn't she?" It wasn't really a question. What happened next moved quickly, the way unravelings do once the first thread pulls loose. Nathan called his best friend Greg, who had been best man since high school, and within an hour, Greg arrived, and the two of them sat at my kitchen table while Barbara made coffee, and I laid out everything. I had the notes, Linda's legal explanations, the information about Brooke's father's failed developments, the sequence of events I had documented over months. I am a retired school principal. I have managed budget crises, difficult parents, union negotiations, and 1,000 small emergencies. I know how to organize information. I know how to present a case. I had not done this to ambush anyone. I had done this because I am 64 years old, and I learned a long time ago that when someone comes for what's yours, you better have your paperwork in order. Greg, who worked in finance and had met Brooke's father twice at family gatherings, pulled out his own phone and showed Nathan something I hadn't known. Brooke's father had 3 active liens against his personal assets. The development company was in the process of being restructured. He needed a capital infusion, and he needed it within the year. Nathan sat very still. At 11 o'clock, he called Brooke and told her the wedding was postponed. She arrived at my house 40 minutes later. I will say this, she did not cry. Whatever else she was not someone who reached for tears when other tactics were still available. She stood in my living room and told Nathan that I had poisoned him against her, that I had never accepted her, that this was exactly the behavior she had been trying to protect him from. Her voice was even and certain and practiced. Nathan looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Did you know about your father's plan for my mother's house before you agreed to marry me?" She didn't answer. "Brooke, I knew he had thoughts about it," she said finally. "I didn't think it was a big deal." "You told my mother her season with me was done," Nathan said. "You said that to her, in her own kitchen. I was trying to protect our marriage. You were trying to protect an asset." His voice broke on the last word and then steadied. "I need you to leave." She left. Her mother called 4 times before noon. Her father sent a text that was carefully worded enough to be plausibly non-threatening and still unmistakably a warning. Barbara screenshotted all of it and forwarded it to Linda. That afternoon, Nathan and I sat on the back porch in the same 2 chairs where we'd watched monsoon storms roll in every summer when he was growing up. He didn't say much for a while. Neither did I. We have always been comfortable in silence. The two of us, it's something you learn when there are only 2 people in a house and the silence doesn't mean anything is wrong. Eventually, he said, "How long did you know?" "I suspected things were off for a while," I said. "I knew about the house the same night you did, essentially. Barbara found out 2 weeks ago and didn't know what to do with it." He nodded. "You didn't say anything. You weren't ready to hear it." He was quiet for a moment. "Were you going to say something? If it had gotten further?" "I was going to say something the day after the wedding," I said honestly. "When you were back from the honeymoon and settled, I was going to show you everything and let you decide, even if it destroyed your relationship with me. Even then. Because you deserve to know the truth, and I would rather lose you knowing I told the truth than keep you by staying quiet." He looked at me for a long time. I have watched his face change from infancy to adulthood, every version of it, and I know it better than I know my own. He was working through something grief, probably, and relief, and the complicated anger of someone who realizes they have been managed by someone they trusted. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have seen it." I reached over and put my hand over his. "She was good at what she did. That's not a flaw in you." The weeks after were not simple. Brooke's father made noise about legal action that went nowhere once Linda sent a single, carefully worded letter. Brooke's social media became briefly dramatic, vague posts about betrayal and people who couldn't let go, but they tapered off when the comments weren't generous. A few of Nathan's mutual friends reached out to me, not to take sides, but to say they were sorry, and that felt like more than I expected. Nathan moved forward the way he always has, steadily, without spectacle. He threw himself into a major project at work and started running again in the mornings, which he had stopped doing when Brooke had suggested it was antisocial. Small things come back to a person when the weight lifts. One Sunday evening in October, he showed up at my door with groceries and spent 3 hours in my kitchen making his grandmother's tamales alongside me. He had never made them before. He watched everything carefully, asked questions, took over the masa when I showed him the consistency we were looking for. He made a mess of the first dozen. The second dozen were nearly right. We ate at the kitchen table with the good placemats and the candles I light when someone I love is coming to dinner. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the house." "Nathan, I don't want it in my name yet," he said firmly. "I want it to stay yours for a long time." He looked up. "And when it does come to me someday, and I hope that's a very long time from now, I want it because you built something real here, not because someone needed a financial instrument." I had to look down at my plate for a moment. When I looked back up, I kept my voice level. "That's a very grown-up thing to say." He smiled. "I had a good teacher. I have been thinking lately about what it means to be strong. For most of my life, I thought strength was about endurance, getting through things, keeping your face composed, never letting them see you break, carrying what needed carrying, and asking no one to share the load. I don't think that's all it is anymore. I think strength is also knowing when to write things down on a legal pad, when to call your sister, when to open the door and let someone leave, when to sit at the kitchen table with your son and wait for him to see what you already see, instead of pushing the truth at him before he's ready to hold it." Brooke was right about one thing, and I will give her that much. Perception matters. People believe what they see. What they saw, in the end, was a woman who stayed quiet when every instinct told her to shout, who kept her records and her composure, who trusted her son enough to let him find his own way to the truth. And what they saw standing next to her was a man who, when the moment came, chose clearly and without hesitation. That's the story I'll take with me. The tamales, for the record, were excellent.